Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great day. This is our group's presentation on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the American Vietnam War. And to start off, just some context and background. So the Ho Chi Minh Trail was essentially a network of supply routes and roads that ran through Laos and Cambodia that was used by the North Vietnamese to transport soldiers and supplies to revolutionaries in the South. Um, at its height, it encompassed 12,000 miles of roadways, and it was a system of paved roads, dirt roads, complex infrastructure. It was a huge and complex system. Originally, it was used, or it evolved from roads used by the Viet Minh against the French. They primarily transported on bicycles and used porters, but by the time of the American Vietnam War, the road was able to sustain trucks and mechanized transport. The road ran through steep mountains and dense jungles, so it was seen as a great place to transport war supplies. And then during the war, 3 million tons of bombs were dropped on the Laotian portion of the trail by the US and its allies. So it was a major target of the war. And it was a huge operation. 230,000 North Vietnamese workers were required to sustain the trail through the course of the war. And because of the infiltration of supplies in the South Vietnam and the success there, it's considered to be largely successful by the North Vietnamese and supporters. And some important events, I'll let you read through them, but a couple I wanted to highlight. The second point, interestingly enough, before the escalation of the conflict, President Diem actually in the South actually requested a similar idea to the trail, a route through Laos to kind of protect his security from the north. However, Eisenhower declined due to the neutrality of Laos. So there was actually this idea of using Laos for the war was actually, there were a lot of different ideologies associated with that. And then the second point I want to highlight is this one down here, June 1965. US Ambassador Sullivan described the road as thoroughly passable. So this kind of, as the war escalated, this trail was already able to sustain mechanized transport. It wasn't just like an unreliable kind of backroads operation. This was a trail that was serious, and obviously that could be seen in the US effort to bomb the trail later on. So some involved agents that we decided to focus on, wanted to focus on the United States, military and government, North Vietnamese from the perspective of the government, the people, and the Highland tribes, and finally Laos and Cambodia. So before escalation, the United States, actually through the entire war, the United States really maintained the view of the importance of cutting off the trail. And this was its goal from the beginning. And there were some different plans to do that that were proposed before escalation. CETO Plan 5 and CETO Plan 5 Plus wanted Laos to be secured from within Laos, and the Rostow proposal wanted the borders of South Vietnam to essentially be walled off. But because of logistics and fear of escalation, none of these proposals ever really came into effect. And instead, reconnaissance operations on the trail were seen as like the best option to attack the trail but avoid escalation in the region. And that was mainly because of fear of Chinese involvement. So the US really, it wanted to attack the trail, but it was also afraid of Chinese involvement, so that didn't allow them to get involved. So instead, at this point, they just supported ranger forces and reconnaissance operations to attack the trail. And just as a side note, actually, McNamara had advocated bombing early on, but Johnson did not initially approve because, again, it didn't want to escalate at this point. However, once the war started, the trail plans to attack the trail and realize this kind of this perspective on cutting off this infiltration of manpower was actually put into effect, I guess you could say. But the thing was, the United States was afraid of Laotian neutrality and violating Geneva agreements. So a major ground force to just march in and cut off the trail was never really put into effect. There were obviously SOG missions and attacks on the trail, but there was never just a full-on ground takeover of the trail. So instead, the US decided to pursue this strategy of bombing the trail, which would be seen in Operation Steel Tiger and Operation Tiger Hound, and then Operation Commando Hunt, which increased these former operations. And essentially, bombing the trail was seen as the best way to avoid these issues of having to violate Laotian neutrality by attacking trail on the ground. Essentially, the U.S. viewed that its strength of air power was so superior that it could bomb the trail into submission, either through making the trail so dangerous that it was unusable, or by coercing Hanoi to stop sending supplies down the trail, just because, because of the loss. So either direct submission or coerced submission, I guess you could say. And Agent Orange was used on the trail to increase this, the goal. So as you can see, just the U.S., its military goal from the beginning was to cut off the trail via bombing, and it saw this as the best option, and it just had this perspective that air power was so strong that the trail could be just capitulated that way. And just some perspectives on this. This top quote I thought was interesting. More maze than a road, the trail disappeared, returned to view, dissolved, emerged, contracted, expanded, split, reunited, vanished, materialized. Killing it was like trying to put socks on an octopus. So I thought that was an interesting perspective, showing maybe why the extent of bombings were so large, because the trail was so complex and difficult that if the US did pursue this policy of bombing, it had to be on such a large scale, because of the complexity. And the second quote I decided to include: my solution to the problem would be to tell them frankly that they've got to draw in their horns and stop their aggression, or we're going to bomb them back into the Stone Ages. I think this kind of just summarizes the American perspective pretty straightforward, that they wanted this aggression into the South, this infiltration of manpower supplies, to stop, and they were going to use bombing to achieve it. And that was really what the US viewed as the best option throughout the war.
Next up is the North Vietnamese perspective. Although most famously known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the term became popularized in the late 60s because of international news reports. The trail was known to the Vietnamese by a few names, including the Trung Son Road, then the Strategic Supply Route, and later Highway 559, numbers symbolizing the date, May 1959, that the North Vietnamese government reached a formal decision to support the Southern insurrection and reunite the country. In conjunction with the formalization of the trail campaign by Ho Chi Minh, the Trung Son Battalion was formed, nicknamed Group 559, which was in charge of road surfacing, logistics, medical services, infantry, and anti-air force squadrons to maintain the flow of humans and goods along the trail. Their motto was, "Blood may flow, but the road will not stop." These soldiers were known for their ingenuity. They would hide trucks within the jungle, they would move during the nighttime, they would explode unexploded bombs that landed on the trail, and they would strategically use their treacherous surroundings to their advantage. You can see their resourcefulness displayed in the photos on this slide, which show a mountain pass made of logs, how the Vietnamese used bikes to transport their supplies, and the various personal sacrifices they made along the way to help their comrades. The trail proved a major military success with the help of leaders like Ho Chi Minh, who was the president of Vietnam and leader of the communist forces, General An, the second in command of Ho Chi Minh, and General Dong Sai Nguyen, commander of Group 559, who allied with the Laotians and Cambodians to expand the trail. Every drop of petrol, every grain of rice transported to the Southern Battalion was soaked in the sweat, tears, and blood of so many people, said commander of the Trung Son Armed Forces. All this time, Vietnamese people found their strength in their strong desire for independence. Many of them did not realize that Americans viewed them as communists, and a veteran named Vu Von Vin, now 66, told a reporter, "People didn't even know what communism was. They just knew what was going on with their lives." At the time, it wasn't very clear why America had invaded a country they had seemingly no ties with, but they fought hard for their independence anyway. As a little note, a lot of the sources I'm using come from Vietnamese news reports. So part of the reason for that is to show their perspective from their own voices as opposed to from the American interpretation of it. The Ho Chi Minh Trail proved a vital lifeline on the country's path to reunification. It also proved a symbol for the mutual friendship between the peoples of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The people involved in the development and protection of the road were very diverse, including local villagers, ethnic minorities, neighboring countrymen, trained soldiers, and youth volunteers. In one story of female heroism, Vu Thi Kim Dung describes how she and other members of the female drivers unit would drive trucks through dangerous territory that other male soldiers were too scared to cross in the middle of the night. When trucks broke down, they would fix them. At night, they would suck the petrol out of the gas tanks so the trucks wouldn't explode if they were hit by bombs. Dung later said, "We were so young that we were not afraid of death." All of the female drivers unit survived. Children were also involved in the war and the Ho Chi Minh Trail development. Youth shock brigades were volunteer forces, and they proved vital to the success of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Before a battle, they always left first for the front line to open the roads, to prepare the front, and then to participate directly in the battle. Later, it was mostly they who came back last, after having cleaned up the battlefield, transported the wounded, and buried those who died on the front. Some of the quotes on this page are from Christian Appy's book, and I would recommend reading them. One of them comes from, both of them are perspectives of women, and both of them had experiences as children in some of these youth shock brigades. So I would recommend going back and reading those.
So now I will present about the Vietnamese Highlanders, because the first question, how they got involved. Different from Vietnamese official nowadays that mention Highlanders as who has a full loyalty to Vietnamese side, to North Vietnam side. Actually, Highlanders has had a kind of negotiation and difficult consideration for choosing which side that they will belong to. Understanding the importance of Highlanders in Vietnam War, both Vietnam and Americans, and also DRV, which is North Vietnam and Laos alliance, also try to attract and gain the loyalty of Highlanders. For French, from early 1930s, they tried to build something called special relationship with people in Central Highlands of Vietnam. With the creation of autonomous mountainous zones, they expected it would be a pose or a threat to Viet Minh. For Viet Minh, they also tried to publish many policy and strategies on the Article 3 of their constitution in 1959. They admitted the autonomous mountainous zones. Mountainous mean mountain people, by the way. But they admit the autonomous zone, but they try to establish socialism in the Central Highland of Vietnam, and understand the importance of small actions. They also try to organize some immediate actions like establishing small schools and medical cares in that areas. So that combining between propagandas, promising autonomy, and social actions, the Viet Minh or North Vietnam got the support of Highlanders, which is play a very important role in the success of Ho Chi Minh Trail. Okay, so how were their roles? Like John Prados mentioned, the heart of the Trung Son system, which is Ho Chi Minh Trail, pumping supplies of the south like blood pulsing through the body with the porters. Ho Chi Minh Trail and porters, which is Highlanders. Ho Chi Minh Trail is considered as a communication and logistics networks, and weapons and food transportation. And porters, which is Highlanders, play a very important role in the transportation, in this transportation system. Central Highlands of Vietnam has a very difficult geography condition, so that just indigenous people, which is Highlanders, Central Highlanders, can understand clearly about the structure of the path and also how to get through some difficult conditions of pathway. However, Ho Chi Minh Trail in not just Central Highlands, but also comply with Laos and Cambodia. You can see in the map here in the west of Vietnam, would be something called buffer border to avoiding attack in western Vietnam. In that sense, so Vietnam or North Vietnam just consider, just focused on the front line of the war, not just, consider most about the west of Vietnam, because they did had the Ho Chi Minh Trail, so in Laos and Cambodia. So that, when we consider about Ho Chi Minh Trails, also should, consider about the border. Okay, finally, I also would like to mention about something called civilization mission. I will quote it two authors, which is Christopher Goldscher and Wilfred Burchett, and discuss about the civilization mission, which is also called Mission Civilisatis. So Goldscher mentioned, quote, "The Vietnamese admit today that their aim was to bring modernity to these backward people, to change their habits and custom in favor of what they saw as superior ones." Or Wilfred Burchett, who is an Australian photographer who captured many, photos about Vietnam War, also mentioned that otherwise it would have been on a short-term basis. It was in accordance with the policies of revolutionary humanism. As my Vietnamese friends expressed it, to let a few rays of life into the backward lives of Thucs people, so that when we consider about Ho Chi Minh Trail, we shouldn't not just mention it as a kind of transportation system, but also consider about cultural role, at least for Vietnamese Highlanders.
Next, I will present about the involvement of Laotians and Cambodian in the politics of Ho Chi Minh Trail. So according to the Department of Cultural Heritage of Vietnam, it was initially built within the territory of Vietnam. Later, the trail was extended into Laos starting from 1961, and then Cambodia starting from 1964. In 1960, with the establishment of the National Liberation Front, the Communist force in the south and Laos consolidated power at the border of Laos and Vietnam, allowing Vietnam to extend the trail going through Savannakhet and Salavant in Laos territory. In 1964, Prince Sihanouk signed a secret agreement with the Communist forces to extend the trail through Sihanoukville port in Cambodia. In 1970, London and his crew overthrew Sihanouk. However, they failed to close the border and disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accord was signed. Afterward, the Communist force further extended the trail deeply into Vinh Phuc and Saigon River, which was very close to where Saigon government based. However, it's crucial to acknowledge that the extension of the trail was not that linear. Hereby, we'll look at the diverse perspective from all three sides and try to contextualize the progressive extension of the trail back into its history. For the Vietnamese side, they said that they were allowed to open up new branches of the trail with the agreement and also the support of Laotians and Cambodia. In this sense, in this case, the Communist Laos and also Prince Sihanouk, who was the Prime Minister of Cambodia by the time. For Laotian sides, it's important to note that there was a Laotian civil war with two opposing forces, the royal government and the Laos People Revolutionary Party. Meanwhile, the Communist Laos was closely connected to the DRB and the NLF, which totally supported the trail. The royal government was repugnant of the actions of Vietnam coming into territories of Laos, but the royal government decided not to take an action because they believed that there was more disadvantages than advantages of doing this. For the Cambodian sides, I want to bring up one article from the GN newspaper. For your information, this is also one of the largest legitimate newspapers of Vietnam. So in this paper, they mentioned about 3 different figures. The first one is Professor Gavin, who was sent into North Bend as an ambassador. Interestingly, this professor was also the teacher of Sihanouk when he was in his high school. Another one is a businessman, Duc Phuong, who was sent and supported by the DRV. He went into Cambodia to do business and also extended relations with hiring officials in Cambodia. With that kind of relationship, he managed to deliver weapons from Sihanouk field port to the border of Vietnam. Later on, Sihanouk himself admitted that there were taxes on weapons going through Sihanouk field port, saying that 1/3 would go to Sihanouk government, 2/3 go to the South Vietnam, and plus the bribery to the London's faction, who later organized the coup to overthrow Sihanouk. So as we can see here, the extensions and operation of the trail in Cambodia specifically was linked to this kinds of diplomatic relations built on the basis of very complicated economic and also political relationship. As I would say here, specifically personal relations and interest group.
In this presentation, we have attempted to decode decades of history, including the voices of different agents to promote more inclusive and complex narratives of the war's events. These narratives go beyond the construction and operation of the trail and military operations. The Ho Chi Minh Trail represents Vietnamese victory and ingenuity and the failure of the American containment policy. It is a symbol of the reunification between the North and South, even as the struggle to unite the people continues. And it provides context for the relations between the government and ethnic minorities, as well as Vietnam and its neighbors, Laos and Cambodia. On this slide, we've included more detailed descriptions of legacies that could be considered from each of the perspectives that we've discussed. That is the end of our presentation, and if you'd like more information, please review the references on our last slide.